As I am taping this episode, Hurricane Helene is projected to be striking the coast of the panhandle of Florida, bringing what's been described as devastating storm surges, and we certainly hope for the safety of everybody there. It's not the only time in history that a hurricane is hit in late September. On September 26, 1955, U.S. Navy P-2V Neptune aircraft that was flying into Hurricane Janet was lost, killing all 8 crew on board as well as 2 journalists. To date, it is the only Atlantic Hurricane Hunter aircraft to have been lost. Rest in peace, heroes. But there was a period, actually more than a couple of decades, when the U.S. government was actually convinced that they might be able to tame nature's vortex. The ambitious Project Stormfury deserves to be remembered. The idea of humanity manipulating the weather is not exactly new. The Smithsonian's Science History Institute notes, for example, the ideas of pioneering meteorologist James Pollard Espy, whose convection theory of storms revolutionized meteorology and resulted in his appointment as the first meteorologist for the United States government, a position for which he laid the basis for scientific weather forecasting. But Espy's ideas went beyond predicting weather. Rather, he argued that he could eliminate droughts, heat waves, and cold snaps, keep the rivers navigable, and render the air healthy by clearing it regularly of noxious vapors. His method? He suggested setting fire to the forest of the Appalachian Mountains, and thus causing a heat updraft that would drive thunderstorms. He suggested setting such fires weekly, preferred Sunday evenings. Smithsonian notes, dryly, although Espy was justifiably celebrated for his convective theory, his reputation was tarnished by the ridicule his rainmaking proposal received. His was not, perhaps, the most dramatic proposal. In the 1880s, flamboyant patent attorney Robert St. George Dyrenforth, a Civil War veteran whom the Lancaster, Pennsylvania intelligencer said had received wounds in nearly every part of his body, theorized that explosions in the atmosphere could cause rain. In 1891, he used his theory on the United States Capitol. The intelligencer writes, "About dawn one morning, the Capitol was awakened by a mighty series of explosions in the vicinity of White Lot. The detonations were terrific and in rapid succession. The populace scurried to the doorways, apprehensive that the warships of some foreign power had slipped through overnight up the Potomac." Now, you might imagine that the colonel would receive some sort of punishment for feigning an attack on the nation's seat of power, but instead, Smithsonian writes, Dyrenforth, with a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, took a team of artillerists to Texas to attack the atmosphere on multiple fronts, with dynamite and blasting powder, mortar shells, smoke bombs, electrified kites, exploding oxyhydrogen balloons, and even fireworks. The results were questionable, although the colonel took credit for every rainstorm in the vicinity, and henceforth the eccentric colonel was called Rainmaker, but the experiments didn't continue. These were but a few attempts, as Professor James Roger Fleming of Maine's Colby College noted on the Smithsonian website. Over the past 2 centuries, dreams of weather and climate control have produced a series of ill-considered and ill-fated interventions, aimed at what at the time seemed to be the most pressing issues of the day, from health and farming in the 1830s, western drought in the 1890s, and fog and aviation in the 1920s, to Cold War attempts to use weather as a weapon, and onto current heroic responses to global warming. But of all the attempts to control weather, one has a particular imperative, and has been the focus of experimentation: the attempt to control one of nature's most destructive forces. The science website How Stuff Works explains, "It depends on how you measure it, but by any way you slice it, hurricanes release a phenomenal amount of energy. The website measures the energy generated by wind, as well as the energy that generates the clouds and rain. In their calculation, a typical hurricane will generate and release upon the environment the equivalent of 10,000 nuclear bombs. And we're just talking about average hurricanes here, they write, not Katrina." According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, since 1980, hurricanes have caused over $1.3 trillion in damage, have been responsible for the deaths of 6,890 people. But as early as the 1940s, researchers began to consider a radical idea. Could we impact the strength of a hurricane? NOAA's Hurricane Research Division explained in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. Since a hurricane's destructive potential increases rapidly as its maximum wind becomes stronger, a reduction as small as 10% would have been worthwhile. The idea began with the introduction of the still used and still controversial practice of cloud seeding. We all know that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. But that is not strictly true, as the science website Skybrary explains. The freezing point of water is 0 degrees Celsius, but it might be more accurate to say that the melting point of ice is 0 degrees Celsius. This is because, for a number of complex reasons, water exists in liquid form well below 0 degrees Celsius. Water that remains liquid below the common freezing point is called supercooled water, and it turns out supercooled water is quite common in certain types of clouds. The website Phys.org explains supercooled liquids are trapped in a metastable state even well below the freezing point, which can only be achieved in liquids that do not contain seeds that may trigger crystallization. Clouds at high altitude are a good example for this. They contain tiny droplets of water that, in the absence of seed crystals, do not form ice despite the low temperatures. That is to say, the water is so pure in clouds that it lacks impurities like dust around which the water crystallizes. The website of NASA's Earth Observatory explains supercooling may sound exotic, but it occurs pretty routinely in Earth's atmosphere. Altocumulus clouds, a common type of mid-altitude cloud, are mostly composed of water droplets supercooled to a temperature of about minus 15 degrees Celsius. Altocumulus clouds with supercooled tops cover about 8% of Earth's surface at any given time. There is, however, a limit. At minus 40 degrees, coincidentally the mathematical point where the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales converge, supercooled droplets will quickly freeze. As NASA explains, air temperatures over jet wings often cool by as much as 20 degrees Celsius, pushing supercooled water droplets to the point of freezing. This is what causes the aerodynamic contrails behind aircraft. The supercooled water in clouds might have been cool, but it wasn't really super cool in terms of meteorology until 1946, when Dr. Vincent Schaefer, working in a General Electric laboratory, made an accidental discovery. The University of Arizona Water Research Center writes that Dr. Schaefer was doing research on a hot summer day and cold temperatures were required. He was using a chest-type deep freezer, and he decided to lower the temperature further by placing a chunk of dry ice into the deep freeze. He noticed an unexpected reaction. While working over the open freezer, his breath had created a small cloud of supercooled water droplets. These droplets appeared as a sort of haze in the freezer when light was shown through them. Introducing dry ice caused the water droplets to freeze due to the very cold temperatures of the dry ice. They froze, forming tiny ice crystals that scintillated in the light. The university notes that the classic experiment is easily replicated. What is most important, however, is the implication. The university website continues. Dr. Schaefer's serendipitous discovery demonstrated that supercooled cloud water droplets, common in clouds, could be artificially induced to freeze. And science began to theorize. If supercooled water in clouds could be so induced, would those clouds then release their moisture? Could scientists produce rain? And as the water was supercooled because it lacked seeds upon which to crystallize, this new idea became called cloud seeding, something that Schaefer initially attempted by flying through supercooled clouds in a plane equipped to drop dry ice particles, much like what had happened in his freezer. The idea of cloud seeding gained enough traction that in 1947 the government contracted with General Electric on an ambitious program to test the process, Project Cirrus. Meg Marquardt of Mississippi State University explained on the science website Earth. Together with GE, the various branches of the government and military formed a coalition headed by GE scientist and Nobel laureate Irving Langmuir, called Project Cirrus, which was to investigate the possibilities of cloud seeding, an early form of geoengineering for a host of potential uses like producing rain in arid regions. But the project soon went after more than rain. Marquardt continues. If an injection of dry ice could disrupt the structure of the storm, the project scientists reasoned, then perhaps the hurricane would dissipate. Right after World War II, science could do anything, says Hugh Willoughby, an atmospheric scientist at Florida International University in Miami. No one had thought through what would happen if you seeded a hurricane. They didn't know about the cloud structure in a hurricane. It was just kind of, let's do it. To be safe, the project leaders decided to test their theory on an Atlantic hurricane that was predicted to wander harmlessly out to sea, away from land. NOAA explains that the opportunity arrived in 1948. It wasn't until late in the following hurricane season that Air Force planes and Navy personnel became available to carry out the mission. On October 12th, a hurricane, designated King by the Air Force Hurricane Office, moved northeastward over Florida, dumping tropical downpours on the southern end, which caused damaging flooding that persisted for days. But the next day, the storm moved off the coast and continued out to sea. King offered an opportunity for Project Cirrus. NOAA continues. This seemed an ideal case for Project Cirrus, as the hurricane was no longer interacting with land and should not affect anyone after the experiment. And so in 1948, the United States Air Force attacked Hurricane King with the same weapons that it had used to defeat Hitler and Tojo, namely one B-29 and two B-17 bombers. NOAA writes that large chunks of dry ice were fed into a crusher on the first B-17 and dumped from the belly into the clouds below. The second B-17 followed a half mile behind and 3,000 feet above to document the cloud changes, and the trailing B-29 was the control aircraft and carried Schaefer to monitor the changes and direct the other two planes. The results were noted, but not spectacular. They first made a half-hour run over 100 miles long, dumping 80 pounds of ice along the way. They backtracked then to see what the clouds had done. Next, they did two mass droppings of 50 pounds, each into one large cumulus top, and orbited the cloud to see any changes. They noticed that after the first run, the cloud deck below began to break up. After the second test, the cloud top continued to grow. Satisfied with their effort, the airplanes returned to base. But then, disaster struck. NOAA writes, the scientists were eager to examine the storm the following day. However, when they flew to the predicted storm location, they had trouble locating the eye. And after some hunting around, they found that the hurricane center was nearly 100 miles west of where they expected it to be. To their astonishment, the hurricane had made a 135-degree left turn and was now moving due west. And on top of that, it was strengthening. That is, after seeding the storm, it suddenly turned, got stronger, and headed for land. NOAA writes, by the afternoon of the 15th, Hurricane King struck Savannah, Georgia. One person died in the storm surge, and $2 million in damage was done to Georgia and South Carolina. Whether the storm was affected by the 180 pounds of dry ice wasn't clear and certainly not proven, but NOAA writes the public's enthusiasm for weather modification slackened. In an era when many science fiction movies featured mad scientists threatening world destruction or worse from their hubris, this event seemed to fit the trope. For many years after, no scientist dared mention weather modification and hurricane in the same sentence. The Hurricane Research Division said simply, embarrassment at the time left a legacy that had an adverse effect upon political and legal arrangements for later hurricane modification efforts. But like a hurricane, the idea of hurricane modification did not easily dissipate. Further destructive hurricanes, as well as the desire to better predict the storms, would give rise to a new project. By 1961, enough had been learned about hurricanes to produce a workable theory. The Hurricane Research Division of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration explains. The working hypothesis was that the area around the eye wall of a hurricane was either inertially unstable or nearly so, and that the clouds there contained abundant supercooled water. Thus, seeding near the eye wall could trigger inertial instability and cause outward migration of the eye wall, leading to reduction in the maximum wind through conservation of angular momentum. The website of Charlotte's Spectrum News 1 explains the larger eye wall would help reduce the storm's winds by reducing the pressure gradient of the system. The hope was to do this before a system made landfall to reduce the potential damage of the storm. Rather than use dry ice, in 1948 another GE researcher named Bernard Vonnegut determined that silver iodide smokes, which are more similar to ice crystals, were more effective at seeding than dry ice. The idea was first tested using Weather Bureau planes on Hurricane Esther in 1961. NOAA explains that the Bureau kept things on the down low until they were sure that the storm wasn't going to pull a swerve on them. The results showed promise. After the seeding, the storm stopped deepening, and this success was enough to take another step. The Hurricane Research Division writes, the encouraging results from Hurricane Esther led to formal establishment of Stormfury, a joint project of the United States Navy and the Department of Commerce in 1962. To avoid the 1948 disaster, Marquardt writes, all seeding with Stormfury was carried out only if a storm met a long list of criteria, including a less than 10% chance of hitting land within a day of seeding, even if the storm made a sudden turn like the October 13th hurricane. The criteria proved daunting, and between 1963 and 1971, Operation Stormfury only successfully seeded 4 hurricanes. While there was no disaster like what happened with Hurricane King, there was a close call. In 1965, project directors chose Hurricane Betsy as a good target. However, historian Carl Whipple explained in his 1982 book Storms, Betsy turned the wrong direction. Swerving from northwest to west, the storm seemed to be taking a dead aim for the Bahamas. Stormfury officials decided that they could not risk seeding, and they canceled the effort. But in an oversight the project overseers would have reason to rue, someone forgot to notify all the press, and a few newspapers reported that the cloud seeding was actually underway. Betsy missed the Bahamas, but careened into Florida, causing 81 fatalities and more than $1 billion in damage. Whipple writes, the repercussions this time stirred the ire of Congress. It took 2 months for Stormfury officials to convince Congress that cloud seeding was blameless for Betsy's abrupt change of course. And in perhaps the strangest criticism, the Salt Lake City Weekly reported, the project raised the ire of Fidel Castro, who accused the United States of trying essentially to weaponize the weather. Admittedly, there's something a bit Strangelovian in the image of Navy fighter bombers dumping chemical canisters into a hurricane. Couple that with an amped-up name like Stormfury, and it all seemed a little nuts. The last attempt of Operation Stormfury was Hurricane Ginger in 1971. While there initially seemed some promising results, NOAA notes that further research found that the positive results inferred from the seeding experiments in the 1960s stemmed from inability to discriminate between the expected results of human intervention and the natural behavior of hurricanes. Finally, in 1983, more than a decade after the last attempt to seed a hurricane, the project was canceled. The Hurricane Research Division writes, by mid-1983, none of the conditions for development of an operational hurricane amelioration strategy could be met, and Project Stormfury ended. The conclusion? The hypothesis was flawed. The Hurricane Research Division writes that Stormfury had 2 fatal flaws. It was neither microphysically nor statistically feasible. First, research finally showed that hurricanes have too little supercooled water and too much natural ice for seeding to have any notable effect on them. Meanwhile, the effects of seeding are often indistinguishable from the natural intensity changes of hurricanes. Project Stormfury wasn't entirely a bust, in that the project helped to learn quite a lot about how hurricanes operate and to improve the equipment and instruments that are used to measure and track them. But it was wholly unsuccessful in the goal of having weather cowboys corral unruly hurricanes. Seems no matter how hard we try, nature still wins. It was an optimistic project at a time when, the Hurricane Research Center notes, the goal of human control of hurricanes was captivating and actually seemed physically attainable. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.